Okay, I think we are live. So hello everyone and welcome to the STAM Student Festival 2020. As some of you may know, maybe you've been at some of our events over the last few days, or maybe this is your first event, but the theme for the festival this year is climate and forced migration. So what we're trying to do is to really highlight and raise awareness to students of the issues that communities around the world face when dealing with climate change and having that threat of migration upon them. So we're extremely delighted and honoured to have Mr. Anote Tong here with us this evening. Mr. Tong is the former president of the Republic of Kiribati, which is a small island in the South Pacific, and it's really at the front line of climate change right now. And over his time as president, and actually now to this day, Anote does a lot of work around kind of climate justice and raising awareness at an international level on the issues that his people in Kiribati are facing. So yeah, we're really delighted to have you here, and I have to say, this is probably the event that I've been most excited to be involved with. So I'm not going to take up any more time, and I'm going to pass you on to our moderator, Saoirse McHugh. So Saoirse is an Irish politician and environmentalist, and she has very kindly come on board to speak at this event with Mr. Anote Tong. So I'm going to pass it over to you then, Saoirse.
Thanks a million, Joanne, and it's my pleasure. So thank you to everyone for joining us, and well done to the STAN team for getting this online. Like, I think, you know, if we take one thing going forward from this coronavirus pandemic, it is maybe expanding the idea of who we can have speaking at different events. And hopefully, like, we don't go back to just having whoever can get there by car or plane or boat, because it has really allowed us to, you know, hear from so many more people than we would have. And thank you to Anote Tong for joining us. I'm really, really excited for this, actually. And so just a tiny bit of housekeeping. If anyone has any questions through the whole thing, just pop it in. Down there's a questions and answers or a chat. I actually don't know which one. You have to click on the two of them. Just pop it in there so you don't forget it as we go forward, and we'll get to them at the end. Maybe around 20 or 20 to. And so many of you will have watched or will have seen the documentary Anote's Ark. I think it was screened on Monday evening. And for those who haven't, I'll just reiterate a few of the things that Joanne has already touched on. Anote Tong was the fourth president of the Republic of Kiribati. He served as the president between 2003 and 2015. And during that time became, I suppose, renowned around the world for highlighting the plight, the unique plight that small island states face in terms of climate change. And hopefully we'll hear a lot about that throughout the evening. As an extraordinary measure, and one that I'd really like to hear about later, and to set an example to the rest of the world, Anote, as president, created one of the largest marine reserves in the world, which is the Phoenix Islands Protected Area, and that has become a United Nations World Heritage Site. So without further ado, Anote, thank you for joining us. I was just wondering, for those maybe who didn't see the documentary, and like I thought that a lot of the footage was, you know, said a lot of it, but could you just briefly describe Kiribati, where it is, the kind of brief geography of it, just give a brief overview of Kiribati, because I think it's a country a lot of people won't have heard of.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and let me thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I'm always very happy to have an interaction with young people. I think it's their world that we will be talking about, and it is important that not only do they participate, but that they be active in doing something about it. So, and but before we ever do anything in my culture, in my country, we always greet each other and then bless each other. So let me do that. And so, you know, it's a blessing. It's a greeting as well as a blessing. And normally you would respond, but I won't hear your response because there's many of you who I'm not able to see. But let me bless you. Come to know it. Thank you for that question. You know, what is Kilbus like? Kilbus is a series of small atolls islands right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I always refer to Kilbus as being at the center of the world. And the reason I do this is because it's actually in the four corners of the world. It's on the, it's in the north, it stretches in the north and south of the equator, and to the east and the west of the international dateline. And it's spread in the middle of the Pacific, the central Pacific Ocean, over a total exclusive economic area of ocean of 3.5 million square kilometers of ocean. Okay, and whereas the landmass, by contrast, is only around 800 square kilometers. Okay, but the islands are so scattered, very low lying. The atolls are very low lying. We don't have hills. We don't have rivers, and they're narrow strips of land. And I think the greatest, the most relevant feature of it, in terms of what is happening in climate change, is the very low elevation. It's on average they're about 2 meters above sea level, and the land area is very narrow strips of land, very little potential for agriculture, but huge potential in the marine resource area. I think that would about sum up what Kilbus would be like. We have a total population of around 120,000 people.
Okay, and for whoever, if anyone saw the documentary, like, it looks like paradise. Like, it's just the blue seas, the sand, it just, the heat, it looks beautiful. But you've referred to it before as being on the front line of climate change and climate breakdown, and I suppose that probably coincides a lot with, or it's because of a lot of those physical characteristics you talked about. But can you explain what you mean by it being on the front line of climate breakdown?
Well, it's, I mean, you've got to be able to see what I've just described in so many words, and also to read the experience over the decades, what you see every day, and then read the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and in particular their projections, because once you begin to connect this, you begin to understand what the future is most likely to be. I mean, we live on these islands, where, for me, virtually all of my life. And so all of the things that are happening, I would normally regard as being part of the normal cycle. But then once you start, so you don't see those gradual, minute changes that would happen maybe every year, but it becomes more noticeable after every 5 years. But once you take it over a longer period, then you would see the change. I have seen the change in the wave action in the very front of my place. I live on the ocean side, right on the sea, and I built a seawall. And along the coral rock, where I used to bath with my young children when they were young, they're now in their 30s, 40s. And now the waves that are coming are actually considerably higher than what they used to be. And experiencing that, and then reading the reports that are coming forward, you begin to understand that something is happening that is no longer part of the normal cycle. And you really have to close your sensibilities not to witness that change. What is happening in over the years is, once in a while we get what we call king tides, and but fortunately we don't get cyclones. Okay, the cyclones are formed on the equator and travel south or north, so we don't have the storms, the kind of storms. If we did, I can assure you our islands would not be there, would disappear in one huge storm. So I think the question is, what's been our experience? Okay, once in a while we experience the king tides. Once they come in with the right wind blow, then we get the waves overtopping the island, damaging the waterlands, destroying crops and homes once in a while. we recover, of course, as the water recedes. We go about trying to rebuild again. But the real concern is, will there be a time when the water will not recede? Okay? And already we have communities who have had to leave their villages because it is no longer, and it's no longer viable. And I know, I take people to a particular village in the island where I went to school, and because when I was a young kid at school, I used to visit that village, and it was one of the most vibrant villages on the island. You visit the village now, there is nobody there. Everybody has moved, migrated into the other part of the island where they no longer get the flooding. And so that's been happening. In 2015. We had a cyclone which devastated Vanuatu, in Cyclone Pam. And but cyclones, as I said, are supposed to move away from the equator. Cyclone Pam came round. I was actually in New Zealand when Cyclone Pam was moving around, and I flew, I think, to Europe. And while I was away, it moved and hit Tuvalu. The islands of Tuvalu were flooded. The waves were coming from the ocean side over the island into the lagoon. Mothers were looking around, panicking, looking for their children and what. Also, it flooded our islands and destroyed a lot of food crops. Food trees which have been there for decades. So this would be an indication that it's happening for the first time. And I think I've always believed that the most immediate threat is not necessarily from the sea level rise, but from the change. For us, would be the change in the weather pattern.
Okay, and just because I think a lot of people won't know, correct me if I'm wrong, the water lens is fresh water, where you get your fresh water sitting on top of salt water, isn't it? Yeah. So is that how? Go on.
That's correct. Yes, it's so we get our fresh water from underground and from the water lens, which is that fresh water lens sitting on top of the seawater in the ground on the island.
Okay. So was it, like you mentioned there, that you start to notice these changes as they build up and build up? Is that how you started to think about climate change, or was this something that was introduced to you in school? Like, when did you start realizing that Kiribati was, potentially in a lot of trouble if things didn't change?
Well, I must admit that we don't talk about climate change. We never did, because I suppose not many people were very interested in climate change. Only the scientists. I must admit this. And for me, the journey was started when I came into office, and I began to get more, to read up, and I was reading the reports from the IPCC, and as I was traveling to deliver my first statement at the United Nations General Assembly, I was asking myself, what is it that's important to us that I need to talk about at this international arena, at the highest international political arena? And because everybody else was talking about terrorism, the usual developmental challenges, and but after reading on the IPCC reports, I began to be worried, because, and it's very clear, because the projections were serious for us. And so I started talking about climate change. I think it was the first time it was ever raised at the United Nations General Assembly. And even as I raised it, I wasn't sure that I was making sense. And there was this concern in the back of my mind: am I making a fool of myself? Because nobody else seemed to be worried. But I kept doing it year after year. And of course, as more reports came out, I think my concern became more consolidated, and I began to believe that maybe I am right. But I think the one of the problems that I faced was nobody seemed to be listening to me. Okay, I was the only one speaking about it year after year, okay? But, there was a time when I thought, am I doing it right? But I think maybe I was actually doing it wrong, because I was angry in my early speeches, because how can the world community not care about what's happening when it seems so serious for us? And so if you follow my statements, the development of my statements at the United Nations General Assembly, my initial statements on climate change were a bit angry, extremely frustrated. But then I realized that nobody was listening, and nobody would listen to somebody who's a radical, who was talking like that. So I began to repackage my presentation at the United Nations General Assembly and toned down a bit, tried to be very rational, but remained radical, I guess, because it was new. But I felt that the human dimension of climate change was very sadly neglected. Everybody was talking about the science, the emissions, the temperature rises, okay? But nobody was connecting this to what it means to people. And I think that was what I set out to do. Incorporate the human dimension on climate change.
And do you think, just going back to when you started your own journey, becoming aware of climate breakdown and the consequences that I suppose will be there for all of us eventually, did you, as president at the time, start communicating this outward in Kiribati? Like, did the whole population come on that same journey with you? Like, if you walk down the street now you're already shaking your head. Okay.
No, it's interesting, but we are a highly Christianized society, and I remember my deep frustration when I was trying to convey this, and I was actually getting opposition from our church leaders, and as I said, we are a highly Christian society, and to oppose the church leaders is political suicide. But I was deeply disappointed because they were not reading the reports, yet they were pronouncing that, no, God has promised that nothing like that will ever happen again. And so I hit a lot of obstacles in the process of raising this. And even more lately, I've been called, a scaremonger? What am I doing, scaring people like this? And so quite frankly, I did not really share this with the people for the reason that I didn't think it would serve any useful purpose for them, because the whole thing is beyond their control. There was nothing they can do about it. It was something that I felt I had to take the fight to the international level, because to make people aware of what the problem is likely to be is simply to make their lives more miserable than it might already be. And of course, people in our culture, we tend to think in short-term spells, okay? Maybe tomorrow, but hardly into the 20, 30, 50 years time. So, and people are saying, we're still comfortable. Maybe we get a bit of a flood, but it's all right, it will go again. And that attitude until today continues to prevail. And the reason is because people are thinking about themselves here today. They're not thinking about the next generation. And I think this has been the problem, because this is where there is the misunderstanding, because we are looking at the same thing from different perspectives. Okay, and our people don't read the reports that I'm reading. So, yeah, the answer to that, no, I did not deliberately. We set up parliamentary committees to look around and to talk about it to people, but the people really, until today, are not overly concerned, because, as I said, people think about what happens if it's a sudden disaster. Then maybe it would make an impact. But at this point in time, and of course, I continued for a long time to face the opposition by the church leaders, and precisely that was the reason I went to see Pope Francis. I actually saw both popes, okay, but I saw Pope Francis much more recently in 2015. And I actually persuaded him to step forward and do something about it. because I felt that climate change, I've always regarded climate change as the greatest moral challenge facing humanity. And we needed spiritual guidance, moral guidance. And so I'm a Catholic, so I thought I would approach the Pope to see if there was anything he could do about it. And of course he did. And I believe he made the difference to the outcome to the Paris discussions in 2015.
I was going to ask you about that because I know Pope Francis has made comments. I'll reveal my lapsed Catholicism here. You know, what are those things that they write out, edicts, or I don't know, like they send them out anyway, the Pope sends them out. I know, but he's made positive comments around the need for climate action, and also more recently around the damage that capitalism does to everyone and to the planet. And I was wondering, I was just going to ask you there, do you think him maybe making a stand on behalf of the church, or he is the church, or I don't know how that kind of thing goes, but do you think that is percolating down through the ranks? So if you were to talk to those church leaders from whom you were facing opposition at the time, like, would you suspect that their opinions had changed alongside the opinions of the church?
I think there is a great role here for the faith-based organizations to step in, and they really have not stepped in. I think Pope Francis did, and I was so thrilled to see him to speak at the 2015 United Nations General Assembly and to address Congress in the United States. And I have no doubt at all. I met this man in Paris, and I said, you know, I hope it comes right. But until today, I believe that he made a difference. And what I would like to see happen is more spiritual leaders to do this, to take this up, because our political leaders are not taking it up. And for many reasons. And I often said, I've heard it said, and I've always believed that sometimes our political leaders are not the best leaders to deal with climate change, because they continue to think at the national level. But this is a global phenomenon where you have to think as a global citizen. It's not about you and your nation alone. And you're not there to negotiate what you can get out for your country. It's about saving the world. It's about saving people. And I think this is one of the biggest mistakes in the international discussions on climate change. You all go there with an agenda, with a brief from our capitals, and we don't have the capacity to depart from them. And it's about ensuring that what is agreed does not impact on our economic prospects. That is the biggest mistake. And I've been saying this, and I continue to make it, and I am in total agreement with Pope Francis. I had a long discussion with him, and I am in total agreement that it's our greed that is taking us off the edge, taking us to tipping points, if not already. And until we can address that, I'm afraid we are continuing to head in that direction.
Yeah, and I think a lot of environmentalists would agree with you, and it's definitely becoming easier to say. Like even 5 years ago, I remember you'd talk about capitalism and people would look at you like you had four eyes and say, well, sure, what else is there? And I was talking to two young climate activists there a couple of days ago, and everyone agreed. So one lady was from Uganda and the other lady was from the States, and across, you know, between Ireland, the States and Uganda, it's been made really clear by the coronavirus that actually it's people that keep everything going, and it's people that run everything. And hopefully it's, I suppose, it'll be one lesson that we take with us from the coronavirus, that really it's a society first and then an economy, not the other way around. But anyway, back to when you became president of Kiribati. So you're president of Kiribati and you start to realize the facts of the matter. What action did you begin to take then? So you set up a committee on climate action, and where did you go from there?
You know, as I said, there was very little we could do back home, because there's very negligible emission to deal with. Okay, we are in this on climate change. We're at the end of the of what is happening, and not quite the cause of it. And so there was little that we could do in order to deal with climate change. All we could do was talk to our people. And of course, as I've explained that. And so I've always believed that where the work needed to be done was at the international arena. And I did focus maybe too much on that, but I was facing a lot of opposition, even from the industry, the fossil fuel industry. And I remember when I launched a call for a global moratorium on the opening of new coal mines, I got a letter from one of the biggest coal mining companies to say I was wasting my time. And I'm sure, I remember this because I got very annoyed. I said, I'm going to write back. And my staff and my advisor said, no, don't bother. The fact that they are writing to you means that you are bothering them. And so I think the fight needed to be taken at a different level. And so I kept doing this, pestering everybody. I was a nuisance to the United Nations General Secretary General. Every time I go to the UN General Assembly, I would try to get a meeting to get some more focus on it, because I remained the only one, even from the region, I was the only one. And I felt very alone because, and I kept asking myself, am I making a fool of myself? Because even my colleagues from the region were not with me. But it took some time. But by the time it gathered momentum, I think it's one of those things that people just didn't focus on. And once they focused on it, they realized how really serious it was. And so it was gratifying to see that change in momentum, the build-up in momentum on climate change, especially after the dismal failure in the 2009 Copenhagen discussions. I was there extremely, extremely disappointed. I tried to persuade the Prime Minister of Denmark, who was chairing this, to see if he could put the leaders together to try and sort this out. Because the leaders would come with prepared statements. It's not a debate. You know, these meetings are just statements. And these statements are made back home. And those back home only know about the problems back home. They don't care about the issues at the international level. So if we must talk about the international issues, we must sit down as an international cabinet, you might call it, okay? And I've always lamented the fact that the United Nations does not have anything like that, where we can discuss global issues, not from a national perspective,
but as a globe. So you have, I suppose, made known the phrase migration with dignity. And I was just wondering if you'd like to talk about that a little bit, perhaps from the perspective of the people of Kiribati, or more generally, like globally, in terms of mass global migration that will be happening due to climate-related issues, I suppose.
You know, one has to read the reports in detail, but it's you don't even need to do that. Just go to the conclusions, and the conclusions are dire. Okay, what it means for countries like Kiribati, Tuvalu, the low-lying island countries, is that they will be submerged in time, okay, over the period. And it's from what's happening already, it seems that it may be sooner rather than later, because I'm hearing that the melting in the north and the south poles are going much, much faster than originally predicted. And so I've always come to the conclusion that whatever we think, whatever we believe, whatever our emotions are, we've got to come to acknowledge the brutal reality that this is coming, and it's going to result in the massive displacement of people. Okay, I know that some of my colleagues in the region rejected my statements on that, and even my own government now has rejected that, saying no, we will stay home. I don't know. It's a dangerous statement, because you've got to look into the future. Again, I believe it's a matter of perspective. How far ahead are people thinking? Can they mobilize? Because I've always believed that our first option would be to try to build climate resilience. And this is why in the film that you saw me talking to people about building floating islands, because I believe we must try as much as possible to remain in our homeland. Okay, and I've been talking, and I actually actively explored the options of building the islands up with to remain above the rising seas, and I continue to believe that that is an option. Okay, but we've got to accept the brutal reality that we cannot raise all of our islands. Okay, and the reason is we could never mobilize the resources needed to do that, and so we have to come to acknowledge the brutal reality that some of our people will have to relocate. Okay? And I went to school in New Zealand, and so I saw a lot of Pacific Island people living in Auckland, okay? And they tend to occupy the poorer slum areas of Auckland. And the reason is because they moved from an island setting into a metropolitan setting without any awareness of what they were going into. They were not prepared. They could not find good jobs because they didn't have the qualifications to get the good jobs. And so we don't want a repeat of that. Migration is not something new. And the flow of people from the Pacific, including Kilbus, to closer places like Australia and New Zealand, has always been to occupy at the lower levels of the wealth scale, okay? So they don't always get the high paid jobs. So if we know that this is inevitable, that some, if not most, if not all of our people will become displaced one day, then we need to prepare them, okay? Because one thing that I always rejected was the notion that our people should become climate refugees. The reason I rejected that is because it's no need for them to become refugees, not if we do the right thing in time. So the concept that I was advocating was a proactive response to what we know is inevitable. And so we need to, as leaders, as governments, we need to prepare our people so that if and when they do decide to migrate, then they will go with people with qualifications, education, so that as and when they go into the communities they go into, they would be worthwhile citizens, good jobs because they have qualifications. And I joke to the people that I meet, our people I meet in my travels, I say, I'd love to see one of you become prime minister in this country one day, okay? And that is my concept of migration with dignity. So people will go, not looking around for jobs, but they go there to be demanded as people who will make a contribution to the community. But part of that concept of migration with dignity is a two-way process. Must also be the preparation of the communities that they move into. I had a discussion with people I met on a cruise, elderly German people. And I'd been watching what was happening with the massive migration from North Africa into Europe. And of course, Germany is certainly one of the most tolerant countries accepting migrants. And I asked them, so what do you think about what is happening? And they said, oh, in the beginning, we were very happy to help. But now it's getting to the point where we are wondering how, what is going to happen to us because it's becoming too much. And of course, there is that gap in cultural understanding. And so that has been one destabilizing element. And so I believe that with migration, the receiving country need also to be prepared to receive the migrants. So that is what I was thinking about my concept of climate change. It's a climate migration with dignity, climate-induced migration. The idea that it must be a proactive, but it's got to, we don't put our heads in the sand and hope that it will not happen, because it is going to happen. The question is, to what scale?
Yeah, and like as you're talking there, that does seem like preparing the the community that's migrating and the community that people will be migrating into, it does seem like the most obvious, like as you're speaking, it seems like such common sense. But what sort of traction has this idea gotten within maybe surrounding countries?
Well, it's I know that I think I'm right in saying that New Zealand was seriously looking at the possibility of accepting climate migrants from some of the more vulnerable Pacific countries. But I know that some of the governments, including my own, rejected the idea, and I think that's dampened the enthusiasm for initiating this. And I understand the idea, because I understand the reaction. It's an emotional reaction, and I don't think people have really got their head around the reality. I went through the same process for a long time. I denied it, and I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know how to respond to a question. If any of my people were to ask me, this is happening, what has government planned for us? Because I had no plan. So I had to go and come up with these wild, crazy ideas, okay? So that at least I can have a response. And my challenge is this: if somebody can come up with a better response, I'd be more than happy. But that was the response that I could come up with at the time. At the time when nobody else was talking about the human dimension of climate change, because it is about people, not just about the polar bears. It's about people.
Yeah. And I suppose like this would be probably something I personally would be really interested in. I was wondering, like you mentioned just there earlier that after the climate talks in 2009, you were very disappointed. But I was just wondering, what did you feel? Like, how did it feel after COP21 in Paris? So, because it struck me when I was watching that video or that documentary, and you see Obama giving a great speech, and he's going to do everything, and you see all these people giving talks, and I was furious watching it. Like, I cried so many times watching that documentary, because I'm like, they could have just fixed it if they wanted to, like, And so how did it feel leaving Paris in 2015, knowing that, well, what was agreed wasn't enough to save a lot of small island nations, and on top of that, knowing how weak it was compared to like if they had decided to then and there, sure, we could be at net zero emissions now, and we could have a really compassionate global response. You don't think
Right.
so?
No, I've always understood that regardless of whether as a global community we cut emissions to zero, our countries will, Kilbus and the countries like mine, will continue to go down. Okay, I knew that. The science was very clear on that. But nevertheless, it was important to get together collectively to try and do something about it. Okay, and so the Paris Agreement was, it didn't happen in Paris, I must tell you. All the preparatory work went on. For me, I visited a lot of countries in Europe and everybody to try and talk to a lot of people to try and get them on board. I was involved in a close meeting at the United Nations General Assembly earlier in September. That was before Copenhagen. And I was disappointed because I was listening to leaders who were saying, oh, if we cut the emissions, our economies would suffer, okay? And of course, in the lead up to our preparations for Paris, at the Pacific Islands Forum meeting, we had our bigger neighbors, Australia and New Zealand, who were saying, I don't think we can afford to go anywhere below a rise in global temperature of 2 degrees, because if so, then our economies would be affected negatively. And I was sitting there, I said, seriously? And I said, it was during a press conference, I said, I'm hearing my colleagues, but please listen to me also. Even a zero rise in emissions would ensure that temperatures will continue to rise, sea level will continue to rise, and my country will continue to go down. So it's not about our economies, it's about the survival of people. And I think this kind of confrontation kept coming. One of the saddest things is whenever there is a change in government and a different party comes in, policies on climate change changes. It's a sad tragedy because climate change is not a political football. It's the reality of what we have to face in future. And so it's the Paris Agreement. Yes, I yelled and yes, tears came down. But I was always wary because I was aware that there were countries who, if given the chance to object, would have objected. But the chair was the French foreign minister, did a wonderful job. He banged his hammer down, his gavel down before there were any objections. But and now it's beginning to unravel. As we know, the United States has withdrawn. Some of the countries also want to do that. And what is also happening is nobody is meeting their target. And so that agreement will remain a piece of paper until we can lend credibility to it by doing what we promised to do, by doing what is needed in order to save the planet.
Why do you think governments have reacted so much quicker and so much more drastically to the coronavirus pandemic than they have to climate breakdown, despite the fact that climate breakdown is like way bigger and they've had a way longer build up to it? But you know, they have shown that they're capable of, you know, using state machinery to very rapidly respond to a crisis. And like, why do you think that's happening? Yeah, with the virus, but not with climate breakdown.
It's a very simple answer. You know, with the coronavirus, everybody is affected, regardless of your status in life. Whether you are a CEO of an oil company or you're somebody somewhere else, okay? Nobody is benefiting from the virus, or nobody stands to benefit from the virus, okay? So what we did as a global community, we did all of the things that we regarded it as impossible to deal with climate change, okay? Our economy is, the global economy is damaged. You know, the countries that I've been talking to and who've been pushing back because it's too damaging to their economies on climate change. They stepped forward very fast on the coronavirus. And the reason is because there's nobody pushing back, because everybody is going to be affected. But with climate change, there are those that benefit from what is happening on climate change. And regrettably, they're the most powerful. And so they've been pushing back. Okay? So, because they think, they don't think, they hope it will not happen. And if it does, they've got the resources to remain above the waters, and the rest can go. And so, and also because and I think I can say this without, because it's been said, and I have said it, that a lot of our politicians are actually collaborating with the corporations that stand to gain by what is happening on climate change. And so there is this obstacle, pushback, whereas with coronavirus, there's no pushback to the measures that needed to be taken.
So coronavirus doesn't have a slick lobby group.
That's right.
So just a few questions coming in from people. One question here is kind of going back to what you were talking about the Paris Agreement. There is one person saying, you mentioned you had to shift from anger. You had to shift from anger to be heard by others. Do you have any practices or techniques that could help you to do that? And how did you manage to build compassion in yourself and in your work?
You know, it's you've got to slow down a little bit, because I don't know. I wonder sometimes, because am I really an activist? I don't think so. I like to think that I'm a rational person, and but that's how I found myself. I was amongst people who were, leaders are normally on the government side and opposing the activists. All right. And but here I was trying to deliver a message which was being totally disregarded, and the reason was because maybe I was sounding what too radical. Maybe I was threatening the comfort of certain interest groups. But I must admit that nobody was listening to me for a while, and I'm sure there were quarters, from certain quarters, I was being dismissed as a radical, somebody from a small island state who really, has no real place in the larger world. And of course, this is relevant. And so I had to repackage my presentations at the UN, and I think I invite the students to check my statements year after year at the United Nations General Assembly. I think later on they will find a very rational me trying to deal with the rational world. And so, but I remain radical, and I've been asked, so what would you classify yourself? I think I would classify myself then as a rational radical, okay? Because I still wanted to do what needed to be done, which many people did not want to hear. But I had to do it in such a way that I cannot be dismissed out of hand. Okay, so I come from a different basis, from the moral high ground. Okay, I don't know if that was successful, but over time, I think more people came on board, and it no longer became a lonely place. And I must say that at this point in time, I'm so happy to see that the young people are involved. And the reason why I'm so happy is because it's actually their world. They need to talk to their parents. And when I was talking to the Australian students, they asked, what can we do? Okay, and we go back to school, go and find the children of the CEOs and talk to them that their parents are destroying their world. Okay, and so I think because sometimes there is, for me, and I'm sure, having done this for quite some time, I sometimes feel, what am I not doing right? Why am I not being heard? Why that I can see what is happening, and the people who can do, the people who really can do something about it are not doing anything about it. That question, the answer to that question remains elusive until today.
I often laugh when, if you're saying, no, we should have a planet where we can all live happily on it, it'd be great, and you're called an idealist, when in reality, if you look at people who are saying, no, we need to pursue economic growth for a tiny proportion of people, even to the point where we make our planet uninhabitable, I often think actually they're the idealists. Like, their ideal obviously is nuts, but I think environmentalists are the rational, practical ones at this hour of the year anyway. So another question here is, someone is saying, do you still hold hope that we can address the issue of climate change and save small Pacific islands? You kind of answered that, saying that sea level is going to...
I think the answer to that has already been made in terms of the projections of the IPCC. And yes, we can still do that, but it's going to require extremely radical adaptation strategies. Okay, and that's going to require resources. This is why I was in such a rush to try and get something done, because we were on the front line, and a lot of countries did not believe they were on the front line. Okay, and I remember speaking in Australia and saying, oh, I know some of you don't believe that what I'm talking about is relevant to your life, but let's wait and see what happens come next summer, whether your bushfires that happen every year, what is going to be like, the droughts and the storms. Maybe it may not affect you, but it may affect somebody that you know, a family member. But what I can assure you, it will keep coming until it touches you. There is no escape from that. And so it is important to understand that everybody has a role in this. And the question will be, can we stop it? I don't think we can save the low-lying island countries unless we can mobilize the resources to build the resilience that is needed. But then given the escalation of the melting rates, I wonder for how long. But for me, I'd be quite happy to raise my islands so that we at least will have a home for at least another 100 years or so. But I think like life, there is an ultimate end. And given the trend of what is happening to our planet, one day there will be an end. We just hope that we can look after it well enough so that we keep deferring that ultimate outcome. I think it would be incorrect to say that we will be here forever, that the islands will be here forever, because we got many things. And so, in answer to that question, no, I believe we can remain above the waters for at least another century, but we need to be able to mobilize the resources in order to do that. Can we retain the same kind of life that we have? I don't believe so. We will have to adapt. I was working on a project, let me share this, on what I call Pacific Rising, and it's about raising the islands. And in fact, together with the leaders of the Marshall Islands and Tuvalu, we were working on a program to do a pilot project in Kilbus to raise the island, and if it works, then we could replicate it for the other countries. Unfortunately, that did not happen because I ran out of time, and the study that I had commissioned with the United Arab Emirates in 2016, I never saw the study, but that was to be the blueprint for doing that, building climate resilience in order to continue to exist and survive, at least maybe towards this, by the end of the century. Yes, we can do it, but it may not be from the sea level rise that's going to be the problem. I think it's going to be the instability in the whole planetary system.
I think what you said there is really important, that, you know, the events of climate breakdown might not affect you this year or next year, but eventually it will come closer and closer, and, you know, it'll touch your life. Because I think, especially in Ireland, there's this sort of, like, everyone knows intellectually about climate breakdown and ecological collapse, but there's almost a feeling that the worst we'll get is a few nice days during the summer, and, you know, it's only countries like Kiribati that will really feel climate breakdown, or at least that's what it looks like people feel in their, you know, in their actions and the urgency. And so I think it's really important to know that, yeah, it's not just going to happen to one or two countries, it will happen everywhere, and it will touch all of us, unfortunately.
And I think we must keep our ears and eyes open, because it's happening all over the place in different forms, as it's, of course, it's bound to happen in different forms. The bushfires in the West United States, in Siberia, the warming, the melting of the polar regions, and of course the reports keep coming. I read them every day, and sometimes I just put them away because I'd love to see something more positive, but it's not coming. Nobody's come to say all of this is wrong. Only those who have an agenda, okay? And it's not looking good. And for the young people, especially the young people who have to live in this world when we leave it, it's not looking good. And I hope we don't continue to believe in our arrogance that we will fix it without technology. No, I don't believe that's going to work. I think that's been the problem. The problem has been our technology. So we kept pushing back on nature and pushing it back, and to the extent that we believe we can do what nature does. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I assure you, we will be long gone, and nature will have the last laugh and say, okay, now I can recover.
Yeah. There was just a climate bill passed or published about a week ago in Ireland here, just, you know, laying out, I suppose, the targets and how they'll be accountable. But in it, they talk about emerging technologies. And I was just like, oh my God, no! Like, just kind of constantly, but we'll think of something high tech. Like, and what I imagine, and I'm not fully sure, but I imagine this is coming from maybe oil companies, maybe gas companies, because I've read articles then talking about us sucking carbon down in this kind of like space thing, and then storing it in old oil wells. Or we could not do that, not pin our hopes on injecting sulfur into the air or iron into the water. But unfortunately, it keeps recurring, this idea of carbon sequestration technologies. Right.
Yeah, it's got to be a genuine desire. It's got to be sincere. But we can't serve the two masters, and the planet is in that desperate situation. It will continue to try to plunder as much out of it as we can. And, it won't work.
One last question, which is a pity because we didn't even get to touch on the protected marine areas, but so it's only an hour. One person asked, do you think people are afraid to learn more about climate change? Like, they may be afraid it could change how they understand their world. So do you think people, decide to just ignore the information that's out there because it's so uncomfortable?
I don't know. I don't think any normal human being would deliberately isolate themselves from information that is important for their life, their future, the future of their children. I think it's really what is important, okay? What they consider important. And until you get events like what we are experiencing, like what the people experiencing the bushfires, until everybody has that experience, it's going to be the case that there are people who continue to believe it's not relevant to their life. But what the point they are missing, sorry?
No, go ahead.
But the point they miss is that once it gets to them, it's going to be too late to do anything about it.
Yeah.
Okay, all of the things that are happening, it's like on the periphery. Okay, the ones on the front line are feeling it. The ones in the further back are not feeling it. But once it gets to them, it means those on the front line are long gone. And because I believe that, I've always said, we may be on the front line today, but if you don't do anything about it, you will be on the front line next, because it's something that will not stop coming. So I'd like to think that there is something that can be done about it. I think we've got to, I've been getting questions, how can we do this? How can we get the message across? How can we be more effective in getting climate action? And my response is I believe that because for me personally, I've been appealing to the compassion and the moral responsibility of people. And I believe those people are on board. It's the immoral people who are not on board. People really don't care who lives or dies, as long as they've got their money, their wealth. There are people like that who are just simply immoral. And we know that there's many examples of that in different parts of the world where indigenous people are just decimated simply because they needed to mine, okay? And discharge toxic waste. There are people who are, and we need to deal with those at a different level, because we cannot appeal to their moral sense of responsibility because they don't have it. We've got to do it in such a way that it would become relevant to what it is that is important to them. Okay? And I joked, go and sit on the front lawn every morning, okay? And just remind them that you care. Because as long as they don't care, you're going to make life miserable for them. Destroying our lives, our homes, our future, the future of our grandchildren, yet they're getting away with it. It's not criminal because the international regime does not provide for that. So does that make them, allow them to get away? I don't believe so. I think we've got to take it upon ourselves to target the people that need to be targeted. the people that are getting away with it, that believe that are winning out of all of this. We've got to make it in such a way, do it in such a way that, with the politicians, it's got to be a political issue. It's got to be an election issue. Okay? But of course, the politicians, they get elected and then they turn back to their priority issues again. So I believe the campaign has got to be more targeted to the right people with the right strategy, because you cannot apply the same strategy to different people with different moral standards. That's been my recipe for dealing with this in response to the questions that I've been asked. It's a bit radical, but I think, they are actually more deadly than our radicalism.
Yeah.
They are deadly, but quietly deadly.
Yeah, their idealism is killing us all. Well, on that very empowering note that we can't let them away with it, thank you very much, Anote, and I think everyone probably got a lot out of that. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I think Joanne is going to just say a few words now to close up the event, and thank you everyone for listening. And yeah, Anote, that was excellent. Thank you. It was a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to really echo what Saoirse said, I think it was such a powerful discussion and one that we really needed to hear. And I think it's important for students to be able to, I suppose, hear those stories from those who are living on the front line of climate change and the actual reality that they are facing and that we will all eventually face down the line. So thank you so much for sharing your stories and your experiences with us. It has just been so incredible to have you here. And we've been very, very honoured and lucky that you are a part of this festival this year. And then also just to thank our attendees. I know we can't see your faces, but we can see that you're there, and we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us here tonight. We will be kind of continuing this discussion in different formats. So we have another 10 days of the festival where we'll have other panel discussions and workshops. So feel free to come along to any other events that you're interested in. I've left our event schedule in the chat box there. And yeah, Mr. Anote Tong, thank you again. And Saoirse, thank you too.
Can I just have a last word? Joanne,
Yes.
let me thank you for inviting me and for allowing me this opportunity to interact with yourselves and especially the students. A final word I would like to share is to, I speak quite often to the young people. And I believe that they must not take business as usual. They've got to step forward because it is their world and nobody else is going to do it for them. The politicians are not always ready to do it. They've got their own agenda. So my advice is next election, you deal with it, go into politics and change the world. But do you have a role in it? Absolutely. You have no choice. You've got to take part and you've got to do what needs to be done. Thank you once again. It's been a great pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Okay.